followed by clouds. Not as cold for tomorrow. High tomorrow at 30. I'm Steve Williams on AM 560, The Answer.
4 above with a wind chill of minus 15. Your next news update, 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Getting inside the head of a madman. Good morning, Amy Jacobson here. John Anthony in for Dan Proft.
Hey.
Of course, I'm talking about Luigi. I don't even want to say his last name, but I think he's going to fascinate FBI profilers for a long time by what he did and how that he played that cat and mouse game. And he had Monopoly money inside his backpack and wrote, denied to fund on his shell casings that were used in the brutal murder of Brian Thompson. And our cultures, our depraved culture's reaction to all of this, women are throwing themselves all over him. He's, like all of his social media posts have been liked. He's raised tens of thousands of dollars for his defense fund because he's good looking. How sick is that? Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, don't you know? She is in a little bit of a sticky wicket because, well, she said this about what happened.
And look, we'll say it over and over. Violence is never the answer. This guy gets a trial who's allegedly killed the CEO of United Health. But you can only push people so far. And then they start to take matters into their own hands.
I mean, she's coming very close, John, to justifying what the shooter did.
That wasn't close. She did. In my estimate, in my opinion, she did justify it.
And the media and late-night TV hosts are acting heartless as they cover this murder.
These are screen grabs of actual exchanges between our members of our staff and their friends, relatives, whatever. Okay, so I would visit him in prison and bake him cookies, maybe, perhaps more, but I haven't thought that far ahead.
So much of the clips we were watching at the top of this segment are driven by the fact that this is an attractive.
We got to drop the banner to show why.
And it is deeply troubling.
They did appear to catch that guy today at a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. It's true. Look, I'm sorry, guys.
For more on this, let's welcome back to the program Chris Ferguson. He's professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, also author of the book Catastrophe, The Psychology of Why Good People Make Bad Situations Worse. And he also has a Substack and a column that we'll get to as well in this segment. Good morning, Mr. Ferguson. How are you?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so let's dig into the mind of this Luigi. I mean, we all know that he went to a very elite, not a boarding school, but a private school that was $40,000 a year in Baltimore, Maryland. Went to University of Penn, so Ivy League, was in a fraternity, was well known and well loved by the people there. What do you think why did he snap?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's important to point out, this is still early days, and the information we can get at this point can be unreliable. So we don't know a lot yet about the psychology of this individual. And we can be sure that investigators will probably have psychologists and other people look at him and try to figure out exactly what his motives were for committing this crime. What seems to be coming out is that this individual had chronic health problems. There's a lot of talk about that he had, chronic back pain. And the implication being is that perhaps he had difficulty seeing a potential road to getting treatment for that. Again, we don't really know the details exactly about what was going on with his medical history. But, the narrative that seems to be emerging is you have an individual who is struggling with health problems, possibly was having difficulty getting coverage for those, and decided to lash out at people either who directly he saw as involved or symbolically saw as involved in his own misery and pain.
And is this common, though? Because his mom said she filed a police report that he was missing November 18th, but she hasn't spoken to him since July. And he's also been off the grid for 3 months, and his friends weren't able to find him. Is that common with killers, like that they go off the grid first before they plan their attack?
Not really, for the most part. I mean, you do get individuals who feel like they're, pressured for one reason or other. They're stressed and they kind of quote unquote snap. They obviously don't go through this sort of long-term period of going off the grid and premeditating what they're doing. This suggested that he, really planned out and premeditated what he was planning to do. We've heard about all the symbolism, the etchings on the bullets, the Monopoly money, and that kind of stuff. So it seems like he took this time, to plan out what he was going to do. But again, we don't really exactly know. We don't have this timeline of exactly what he was doing during that time. But it hints towards some kind of premeditation here.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of this growing fan club for him? I mean, it's sick. They had a lookalike contest 2 days after Brian Thompson was murdered. They have wanted posters that have been put up in New York City showing photos of various healthcare CEOs and Brian Thompson himself with an X over his face.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that? And also merchandise. There's more merchandise that glorifies the killer that's on, SD and eBay T-shirts with deny, defend, and depose.
Yeah, you definitely see, some degree of glorification of killers. And I think this individual, he's a good-looking guy, so that's going to play some role into it. So that's why we're seeing some of the fan club sort of mentality. I know Jimmy Kimmel had a segment last night, kind of hinting towards some of that. What you can see is in some situations you can kind of call it like Robin Hood like phenomenon, that when the general populace feels like they're getting a raw deal, that society isn't handling their needs, that there are these evil people who are keeping them down, that sometimes they can, look towards individuals who seem to strike back at that, and they think of them as being heroes. Now the reality is, of course, it's, a lot of people are going through problems with their medical coverage that have chronic medical conditions. Most of them don't commit murder, as we know. So I think there's always a certain amount of risk when you see people do this. They say, well, this guy is striking one for the people. That oftentimes the individuals who do go from just grumbling about their problems, which is very, very natural, to actually lashing out and, committing horrible crimes, that they're really not that great people, that there's other things that are going on, beneath the surface, that maybe they're not the hero we think they are. And again, we don't know in this case. We don't know a lot of details about this individual yet, but I would be a little bit cautious about engaging in the hero worship at this point.
Yeah, Chris, I want to shift gears a little. Now, I'm on your X account. Is this 2 books, Suicide Kings and Moral Combat? Is that 2 books or 1 book? And is that just one title, Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong and How Madness Shaped History? Is that 2 books?
Those are 2 books. Yeah, the Moral Combat one, is nonfiction about video game research. The Suicide Kings is actually a mystery novel.
Okay.
I do a little bit of everything.
well, I only mention it because I'm somebody who's my son committed suicide 3 years ago, and I told a story yesterday about how I was driving down the street, saw a kid on the side of the road in the ditch. And I basically saved him from committing suicide a couple of days ago.
Because he was going to jump in front of a car, right?
That was my thought, that he was going to jump in front of a car. And I see an article that you had written on your Substack, cell phone bans in schools may harm youth. Now, I remember when it was, I actually got arrested for having a pager in high school way back in that year.
What do you have a pager for?
Well, listen,
John.
People have to get in contact with me, especially the ladies, So I'm just saying, I was in high school.
Had a pager for women, please.
but they said I did it for drugs, but I didn't.
Okay.
But do tell us dig more into this story about cell phone bans in schools, and why you think it may harm the youth of today.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, these are obviously becoming all the rage. We're seeing a lot of states, including my own in Florida, that are instituting these bans in schools, preventing kids from using cell phones. It seems very intuitive to a lot of people, the idea that, we take the cell phones away, kids will be paying attention more in class, and maybe it will help their mental health. And there are a couple issues. It's first off, these policies which feel very intuitive, there's no evidence yet that they actually work. So there's always a bit of a risk of putting policy before data, before we actually know that they're going to be useful. What we're seeing right now in the research is that, contrary to what a lot of people think, that spending time on social media for teens does not seem to be related to mental health concerns. Other things like abuse in the family or, having parents that committed suicide, that seems to be, related to those outcomes. But cell phone use or social media use is not. The other thing we're seeing is that, at least, I have data from, the school district here in Orlando that we're seeing an uptick in suspension. So some of these kids at least are now getting suspended from school because they're violating these cell phone bans. And one thing we don't know that the cell phone bans help, but we do know is that suspensions hurt. We know that kids who get suspended, their academics decline, their behavior declines. It's associated with adult arrest. So there's a very clear downside to these, cell phone bans. And that's not to say that maybe the data won't suggest they do help overall, but I think the way they've been implemented has been really, really problematic. Because if it turns out that they don't help, there's a lot of sunk costs, and it's going to be difficult for policy makers to admit that they made mistakes.
But Chris, when you look at, because I remember, I'm from when we used to do legislation, especially as policy related, as it related to kids, I would always hear a kid's mind hasn't really fully developed until they're 24 to 26 years old. With this constant having a screen in front of your face, or watching these violent things, because I don't know if you know who Lieutenant Dave Grossman is. He's written a book on combat, on killing, and he talks about how a lot of these violent video games and things of that nature is part of, and just sitting on your phone all day, every day. Is there any cause and effect as it relates to the maturation of the brain and all of these different the television and the violent games and the movies and the constant, because growing up, I'm sure all three of us, we didn't have to worry about 24/7 news. We didn't have to worry about having basically a computer in the palm of our hands.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, we, 20 years ago, we really went through, many of the same issues with violent video games that we're going through today with social media. Everybody was panicking. Everybody wanted to, ban kids' access to these games and stuff. And kind of now it's died off a lot. The reality is that there just wasn't good evidence that playing violent video games was associated with like school shootings or bullying or aggression or anything of that sort. I've read Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's book, and my impression of it is that it really was not. It really didn't accurately discuss what was going on in the research. I would ask for your $20 back, to be honest with you, from that book, No, it really was not an accurate portrayal of what was actually going on in here. So we know a lot of people don't like violent video games, and so what happens is people mix that up with, this is actually a public health concern. And the same thing is going on with social media. A lot of older adults, and increasingly I'm an older adult, don't like social media, and so we think it must be bad, for teenagers. And you reference, our days, before. You're absolutely right. I didn't have a computer in the house. I didn't have a smartphone. Gen X, the generation I was in, was the worst generation on record. We actually had more problems with violent crime and mental health and suicide. Kids today are doing overall much better than kids 30 years ago. The one thing we are seeing an uptick, and only in the United States, not other countries, is, we are seeing more teens committing suicide, but we're also seeing more older adults committing suicide. So actually the generation that commits, or the age group that commits suicide the most in the U.S. is middle-aged white men, for the most part, and young Native American men. Those are the two groups that commit suicide the most. A middle-aged man is more like about 3 to 5 times more likely to commit suicide than a teenage girl. Teenage girls commit suicide the least of any demographic group that you can kind of imagine. So what's probably happening is that, yes, this is kind of a problem for some teenagers, but as I mentioned, that's probably because their parents have mental health problems, and that is trickling down to them themselves in a lot of these situations. Not something that has to do with technology. And that's why we're not seeing the same problems in like the UK or France or, the Scandinavian country. Europe isn't having the same problem with teen suicide that we're having. Canada and Australia are not having the same problems with teen suicide that we're having. This is a very American phenomenon, and it's a cross-generational phenomenon, and we need to figure out why. But unfortunately, we tend to get distracted by these techno panics because older adults already don't like these things, and we just think we can just get rid of these things, and kids will, be fine.
And it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. And even looking at schools, I mean, there's no evidence that there's a problem with kids' attention. Kids don't like school. I mean, that's the thing, and that's been true forever. If you look at standardized testing scores, they just haven't changed in 50 years. There's no evidence that they got worse during the social media.
School was my oasis. That school was my oasis.
I loved school.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why
my school with a passion.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Because I grew up in a home where my mother was addicted to crack cocaine, and so that was like the place that I went to escape from everything that was that I was going through at home. So that was, that's why I love school.
So, Chris, do you think in the future we'll have more, data about, reducing social media time and if it improves mental health? Because your article, I read it, cell phone bans may harm youth. I completely disagree. And I know you tried to get data from Orange County School District.
Yeah.
But just as somebody who's been around the public school system for a long time, they started implementing in Chicago where they come into class and you put your, kind of like in a shoehorn, you put your cell phone in one of the sleeves and then you get it back after class.
Yeah.
So we still have to wait to see if that data, if their grades improved from this.
Right. Yeah, we're hoping to do that pretty soon. I mean, one of the things that's kind of nice is, some states are putting these into place and other states aren't. And it's not a perfect comparison because, of course, all the states will be different. But this will give us some opportunity to look at, are the states that did these bans showing more improvement than those that don't. The one thing we're seeing right now is that youth outcomes are across the board improving. They've been doing that for the past few years. We saw some declines during the COVID era, not surprisingly. And now kids' academics are improving, having nothing to do with cell phone bans. Kids' mental health is actually improving. Teen suicide went down in 2022, and the CDC reported that teen mental health has been going up as well. So we're seeing some improvements already. Now, what the risk is people might see these improvements and think or they might think it has to do with something that doesn't have to do with. They might think it has to do with these cell phone bans, but we do need better data. What I can say is that the studies that have been conducted, which don't look specifically at cell phone bans in schools yet, unfortunately, but the studies we do have, just looking at teens more generally, does not suggest that time spent on social media has much impact on either academics or mental health. And most things that people are worried about, like bullying, is down. Everybody talks about bullying, and that's certainly a thing we worry about. But bullying has been going down, even when you factor cyberbullying in. Self-reported bullying by teens has been going down. School violence has been going down. Most of these things are already going down. And what's probably going to happen is it has nothing to do with cell phone bans. But of course, policymakers will try to take credit for it anyway.
Amy, I know we got to go, right?
Yeah, we're up against the clock.
Okay.
All right, Chris Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us. You can follow him on X at CJ Ferguson, GUSON 1111, professor of psychology at Stetson University in Florida, and a well-known author. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Me on today. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.